going to be a demo on how to trim cylinder on the wheel. In particular, a cylinder that's a little bit on the dry side, as this one is. So we'll go over how to center on the wheel to get ready for trimming. Go from there. Okay. How to center on the wheel. Get your pot, and there's rings on your wheel head. You're going to find those rings and try and line it up as close as you can with those rings to get it where you think it's pretty much in the middle. And you get it spinning a little bit and see if you were close. That's still vaguely close to the middle, but you can see it's wobbling significantly. So I brace my hand up and hold it so that it's just, I move in closer until it touches in just one spot. Then I stop the wheel where it's touching and push it away from myself. Get it going again, rinse and repeat. So, wait until I find that, try and push it so that it gets a little bit closer to that center each time, until when I start touching at one point, it's touching pretty much all the way around. That's when I know I'm done. You also want to choose the part that you're going to consider your center. Right down here, there's those places where it's been dented a little bit. And usually there's a little bit of a wobble from down here at the rim to here at the foot, so we're not really worried about that. I was going off right here just before the foot, but I'm also noticing there's a bulge there. So right here is where I'm going to consider is what I'm going to base as center, and it will become my perfectly centered portion of the pot. As wherever I center this, we're going to make that the perfectly centered part. Now this one's dried out a little bit, as I said, but that doesn't matter for this part of the process. So, you get wads of clay, and you're going to press them against to hold your pot where it is on the wheel. You can also use moisture on the wheel head, but then you have to center more quickly, and that moisture can help stick it down. You can also put a little bit underneath there, but that's risky because you might put a little too much and have it be softening and messing up your rim. When you push these down, you're not pushing them into the pot. You're going to push them down against the wheel head right next to the pot. So you're not denting it. And I'm also pushing in opposite directions at the same time, because if you push one on, you're going to slide it off to one side, and then you've lost your center. Now double check and see if it's still centered. It's still pretty good enough for me. So now I'm going to do the other two wads of clay on the opposite sides. I like to do 4 because you get those opposites. Again, if I push in, I'm going to either push it off center or dent my pot. If I push down, the clay will naturally spread out a little bit, and usually that's not enough to damage anything. They don't have to be touching like this. They can be smaller wads of clay. We get that. Okay, so there we go. Now your typical trimming is right through here. You've got clay that's a little too thick, so you're going to trim. Now this, as it's coming off, as it's ribbons, comes off in ribbons. That's the consistent we want it. These ribbons are more breaking apart into little chunks and powdery. This is too dry. This is borderline bone dry, and so we don't want it to get to this state before we trim. But if it's already gotten to this state, you still got to get it trimmed, and the sooner the better. So if you have a bump right there, now like there's a dent, and especially when the clay's firmed up a bit, you try and fight that dent, and you're just going to be fighting it quite a bit, and the dent doesn't go away. You can still see right where that dent was, and it's making a deformed part of my pot. I don't like it deformed, don't want it deformed, so some things we can do. You can take your needle tool and just inside of there, I'm gonna, and then I wobbled, so I'm gonna get rid of that line I just made. And I've already messed with this, showed a couple other people some things on this, and it does throw you off just a little bit. But I'm going to go find the line I want to be the new perfect centered roundness. I'm going to cut down slowly with my needle tool. Oh, and like I said, I've messed with that, and so it's doing some other funny things. I might not use this part of the demo. And then I cut down with my needle tool in one direction, and then I cut in the other direction. And I can cut off that lump without riding the clay in that lump. And now this is breaking off because, again, this is too dry. Usually that'll just peel right up very nicely, leaving a perfectly centered piece right in the middle. These little hook tools, they're not all in your kits, but we've got enough that you can borrow one. Some of you have these in your kits as your needle tool, but this hook thing is useful for sculpting, sgraffito, and it's quite nice even for trimming, especially when it's too dry. More similar to the Chinese style trimmers, the Asian style rather than the Western style. Trimming tools. Western style, we usually have the flat ribbon tools that cut it off, and the clay comes off a little bit differently. The Chinese style is different because their trimming tools are designed for bone-dry porcelain. We trim in the West, we typically trim when it's leather hard because we're using stoneware, not porcelain, and it's also good because of the dust hazard, which when they developed their style in China, they didn't know about it, and the whole silicosis lung cancer thing. And now they either don't care or they take some precautions I'm unaware of. So you're going to start trimming away the bulk of the clay until this part, we don't want to leave this, you're going to trim in here where it's thick and make your glaze catch. So this is your glaze catch, but I don't want to see a hard line right here at the top. I want to trim this out until it is a smooth part of the rest of the form. So that this is one continuous form. And then I'm going to try and steady this out a little bit because of what I messed with it. I messed with it before when it was nice and soft, just to show somebody something, and meant to get to this sooner, and let it dry out a little too much. Some of these fixes would have been really easy when it was soft, and they're more difficult now, although not impossible. So this bevel in particular was wobbling thickness, but now, okay, so we've got a glaze catch, and this can be larger or smaller. You can make the width of the foot wherever you want it to be aesthetically, but functionally, as the glaze runs down, it needs to have some sort of little bit of a shelf for it to build up on, and then it needs to have this bevel so that where you have a clear spot to wipe up 1/4 of an inch without actually wiping onto what would be considered the foot or what would be considered the form of the thing, so it looks like it's glazed all the way to the bottom, because you've made this bevel part of the bottom. We're talking about this 45-degree angle looking thing right here. So this is the part it's going to rest on. This is the part that's facing the ground, gives it a little bit of visual lift, shadowing underneath, and when I'm going to wipe, I'm going to glaze the whole thing, and then I'm going to take my sponge and wipe it, just like that. And I can easily wipe all of the glaze off of that 45 bevel without getting any of the glaze up here. So I have a nice clean line where my glaze ends. And it also makes it a little more presentational. I like to have this be substantial and noticeable in a lot of my pieces because I think it makes it a little more presentational. Other people want to make it as small and unobtrusive as possible. There is no better or worse way. As long as you've got all three of the elements, the glaze catch, bevel, and then, or I guess 4 elements, I suppose, part that it rests on, and then an inset portion of the foot for the inset in here. Smaller or larger it'll matter because the larger glaze catch, you can be a little more risky on runniness of glazes and experimentation, where if you've got a small glaze catch, you're going to have to be a little more controlled and be more cautious and conservative in your experimentation with glaze. And if you plan on using iron red and jet black, those are nice stable glazes that you don't need much of a foot. But if you want to use fake ash anywhere near the bottom, you're going to have a serious glaze catch because fake ash is a really runny glaze. Vegas red and turquoise are also quite runny. And particularly combinations of any of those become extremely runny. So trying to match this to whatever the inside form is, before I put this down, I took a look at it and tried to get it pretty close. If it's leather hard in the softer stages, you can press just a little bit and see if you can feel a flex. If you push it in lightly and it doesn't do anything, then it's still thick. If you push in lightly and it flexes, so you push in and it's going to go slightly. That flexing shows that it's just about the right thickness at a medium leather hard, right in the center of the leather hard stage. And if you press it in and it just dents really easily, then it means you're getting too thin and you should stop right away, pull it up, and then press your dent out gently from the inside because you're already almost trimmed through. You're getting on the too thin side. So I'm going to double check this, make sure this part is even and any irregularities have been trimmed away. Then I'm going to use the corner here to try and trim a line in just to help define the edge of this, the actual part of the foot that it rests on the table. So I define that edge, and then I'm going to stop my wheel and check, measure with my eyes, see is this side fatter than this side or any of these. Is there a fat side and a skinny side? I don't see one, so that's close enough for me. Now that I've made that line and it's centered, I can go ahead and trim that line nice and deep. If it's not centered, sometimes while you're trimming, you knock the thing off center enough that you need to recenter here. And if I was going to recenter, I could just push my wad of clay a little bit, or pick up this one and push it just a little bit to slide it very gently in one direction or the other, wherever it needs to go. I haven't really shown using this larger trimming tool. It's good for larger shapes and forms, which can make it better for smoothing things out. You're getting those wider ribbons of clay, and so it's good for that. You can also use different parts of it to get at different angles, and where the other one, it's pretty much the same size, but you've got the flat side and the round side, and of course those are going to be a little bit different effect depending on which one you were using and which one you want and all that. But there is no right way to use. You should use this tool at this point and this other tool at that point. Mostly depending on the form of your pot, there will be different shapes that are working and shapes that are not working. So the correct one to use is the one that's working. I'm going to trim across here. Now that I've got it moderately deep, I'm going to start moving inward and try and keep really steady. There's some bumps and irregularities. I don't want to ride up and down too much with those or they won't go away. Which is why I'm using the corner and making all these little lines, because that corner is going to be pushed up and down less. It's going to cut into that easier, so that with this one little edge, I can take out just that little bit of clay that is trying to push me off. There's also a piece of grit in there that I either set it on or it was in the clay. A piece of rock or grit or something. Not really sure. Might have trimmed it out, but we'll see. Some people leave some lines in there as a decorative element, but make sure you're doing them stylistically. Those are just working lines. That center thing doesn't really go with what I've got there, so you'd want to get rid of that. Mostly, I just smooth it out. And I sign down here. Now, when you sign, for the purposes of the class, I require certain things, and they're minus the class number, or A3, your class period. They're pretty good, solid professional rules. You want to put first and last name. Now, sometimes you can't fit it, and it's appropriate to shorten one of those, first or last, into an initial. But don't just put your initials on the bottom, because there's going to be hundreds of EBs out there, and the idea is your initials, your signature is supposed to identify that it was you who made this. And so initials aren't going to cut it. Some potters will make a signature stamp, which is an image or a specifically designed signature that they make a stamp and they will press it into things. Others will sign their name right across the bevel here because they want this to be clean and smooth and part of their piece, and others sign right across this. An example of a signature stamp, which I don't actually use a stamp for it most of the time, but it's a defined signature. I'm not quite done trimming this out. I want to get closer into that edge, so I'm using this here. You can also use that square corner, or even just take your needle tool and press down here until that goes away. You want to keep pressure down, or if your pot starts to wobble, this has got a little bit of wobble, which I could press those in a little bit more firmly and help reduce some of that, but if you push on the side, it's going to come off. You can still knock it over even with that bracing it down there. Those are just supposed to help a little bit. So I do a specific, I tie my initials all together, and it's called a monogram. But J.R.R. Tolkien has a really cool one. Ooh, you can use that as a signature stamp. Now that, which I just did, took a big chunk out of here. Gotta be careful, or that will really mess you up. And if I go in and start and try and just trim that down, it's not gonna work. I'm gonna try and fail a couple of times. So I'm gonna take some stiffer clay, but that's still soft. Get it wet. Put a little bit of light scoring in there. Get that wet. And I'm going to press that clay in. Now it's softer, so it's still going to want to dip a little bit, but not as badly as it just not being there. And also, because this clay is on the dry, this clay is drier, and the clay that I just put in was not really soft clay. It will draw the moisture out fairly quickly. Now I'm going to burnish that so it's smoothed out a bit, and then try and pull off the excess without putting a lot of pressure, because then I'll be riding up and down with the bumps. Okay, now at this point, I could just leave it and hope it's going to work well, but I'm a lot safer if in order to make the whole foot be similar, I'm going to run water around there so that there's not an abrupt This is hard clay, this is soft clay. The moisture soaks into some of the soft clay and also soaks in some of the hard clay around it. So when it's pulling it out of the soft clay, it doesn't have that separation, which is likely. You can get that. The other option would be to trim very carefully so that I've got all of those trim very carefully down until I've got that all the way leveled out, and make sure I'm not riding that bump. So I've trimmed away my little dent divot thing. In the meantime, I'm going to leave that part of the foot alone, but I can still trim in here. I'm going to give that a minute to finish equalizing the moisture a little bit before I run the trimming tool over it again. I'll smooth it out and be ready to sign. Across here. Depending on how you use it, depend on some people, every time they use this one, you get all of these lines. It's because you're holding it at you're watching your corners and holding it at the right angle. Flat one can actually get quite a smooth side. Some people find it much easier to use the curvy one. Really doesn't matter if you change the angle. If you're holding it out like this, it's going to take away a lot more clay. Holding it almost parallel, clay that it takes away is going to be a little bit smoother, have a different appearance. I like to trim away as much as I possibly can, especially down here. You have to leave some extra clay down at the bottom, because otherwise it has to be a little thicker at the bottom or it will collapse, because the clay is soft and it needs that extra thickness in order to support the weight of the piece while it's plastic. Once it gets to the leather hard stage, it can hold its own without that. So, got nice continuous curve across there, glaze catch, bevel, foot, inset foot. Based on the way that was curving in and how thick that was and how thick this is, I can't tell by pressing. Usually this is where I really do the flex test, and I can't tell because it's too bone dry. So if I want to see whether this is finished, I'm going to make a couple of little marks here so that I can remember which way this is facing. Those are easy to trim out. I'm going to pull off two of